Hello and welcome to Motorsport Extra. It's Ben Evans and Keith Collantine with you. And, well, to start the show, thank you so much for all the very kind and constructive feedback that we had from the first episode. It's been great to have so many people listening to this and really engaging with what we're doing. And as is going to become traditional, Keith, since we last spoke, where have your motorsport travels taken you?
Well, mainly to the BT Sports Studios in Stratford. We've been talking about motor racing an awful lot over there, but obviously big highlight of the past week or so for me has been talking so much about the Indianapolis 500. I was in the booth for both days of qualifying and for the big race itself, which was just 24 hours ago. We were in there.
Yeah, and for me, I had a great weekend in Spa, a puncher just outside Liège accepted, but particularly a very, very wet day on the Sunday, and then an absolute pleasure to join you to talk about the Indianapolis 500. And then the real highlight, of course, has been the Hello Kitty ride that I took today, which is pure motoring passion at an unnamed farm park.
Yeah, Bank Holiday Monday, we're all spending time with the kids.
Exactly. Well, there's only one place to start, of course, and that is the 100th running of the Indianapolis 500, and something of a shock win for Alexander Rossi, American and a rookie, a dream story, but maybe not quite the way we expected it.
It was an absolutely stunning result, and at no point, I think, did we predict Alexander Rossi as a potential winner of the race, mainly because he was a rookie, like you say.
Well, I'm going to have a very, very large slice of humble pie, which is that for the BT Sport coverage, we shot an extensive feature with Alexander Rossi. Our producer, Nick, was saying to me when he was leading the race at about two-thirds distance, run this feature, he's going to figure. And I said, no, he's not, he's going to fade back with the pit stops. And then, of course, he came through and took the win. But I think it's probably worth, Keith, explaining how he came to the situation to take victory.
It was a remarkable development. I mean, Andretti had a great setup on their cars, and for most of the race, Ryan Hunter-Reay was the main one of their drivers in contention. He led 52 laps, so he led more than a quarter of the race. And Townsend Bell, of course, their guest driver, was well up there as well. Of course, we all know what happened to those two drivers. They managed to tangle with each other in the pit lane. But in a way, that sort of inadvertently paved the way for Rossi to take this incredible win. You remember we were in the studio booth and we were looking at the strategies and trying to figure out at what point could drivers come in and make their last pit stop and run clear to the end. We reckoned it would be about lap 168. Then Takuma Sato got up in the grey at the exit of turn 4, brought out the safety car with just a few more laps before that magic lap 168. So on lap 164, 19 drivers came into the pits at once. Any one of those drivers, given that Alexander Rossi was one of them, could potentially have gone on to win the race. And there were even drivers who pitted later than that who ran too hard and had to come in and make additional pit stops. But Rossi came in and he managed to make his fuel last to the end there. And a big part of the reason why he was able to do that was because Hunter-Reay had fallen back. He was more than a lap behind. And Andretti had Hunter-Reay give Rossi a slipstream to help him save some fuel. That paid huge dividends in the end.
I think what's really interesting as well is that there were three drivers who pitted after Rossi: Simon Pagenaud, Helio Castroneves and Sébastien Bourdais. And Bourdais had 2 laps on everybody, and he still couldn't make the fuel last. One of my thoughts reflecting that overnight was, is it actually the benefit of the Formula 1 experience for Alexander Rossi in races that are very fuel limited in Formula 1? He knows how to drive with fuel economy in the way that some of the other guys who've been in IndyCar for several years don't.
It could well be a part of that as well, and the benefit of the tow he got from Hunter-Reay. And then obviously it came down to that final lap where he was absolutely nursing it home, and he was over 40 mile an hour average slower than the leaders were, and he had Carlos Munoz bearing down on him right at the end. But I think ultimately the fact that he was able to put that all together came as a massive shock to everybody, and not least the driver himself. I mean, when he took his helmet off in victory lane, he looked absolutely thunderstruck.
And what was bizarre is, maybe I'm being a little bit harsh, I've always thought he's a very talented driver, a very good driver. I've never seen him as an elite caliber racer, and yesterday maybe didn't do an enormous amount to dissuade me of that in terms of his outright pace, wheel-to-wheel dicing. But I was just so impressed that he managed that fuel, drove with such a level head and consistency. There was a lot of people complaining online going, it was a damp squib as a finish. Rossi wasn't a deserving victor, which I felt was very unfair. He had a circumstance and he exploited it perfectly.
I don't think it was a damp squib of a finish at all. We've seen this kind of action in IndyCar racing before. Sometimes it resolves itself in two drivers swapping the lead for lap after lap towards the end. We've had that the last few years in the Indy 500, but sometimes it will be, who can stretch that last bit of fuel out to the end, and you did not know. We didn't even say in the commentary booth, I think, until he was out of the last corner, wow, he is actually going to do this, because when the fuel goes, you come to a stop pretty quickly.
Well, there were some opposing strategies. Carlos Munoz and Joseph Newgarden just decided to go all out, and they got within 4 seconds of the win, despite an extra pit stop.
And Munoz was devastated because he knew he had a really good chance to catch up. He was absolutely flying at the end, and so was Newgarden. He was very, very close behind him as well, and I think they crossed the line only covered by a few tenths of a second, so it was really, really close for second place as well. I mean, there's absolutely no question. Had it been a lap longer, perhaps even a mile longer, we would have had a different winner.
Well, the fairy tale story we didn't get was James Hinchcliffe converting pole position to victory, and it almost felt as if he was a victim of circumstance. Starting from pole and having such a good car underneath him, he almost had to pave the way with the race strategy, and that meant the team couldn't exploit the way the race then begun to change with the safety cars and the cautions.
It particularly felt with Hinchcliffe, the way the track conditions were changing, he didn't quite have the car underneath him to stay up in the thick of the battle for the lead. Obviously, in the opening phases of the race, we had that terrific extended exchange between him and Ryan Hunter-Reay that was absolutely thrilling, but I don't think he quite had the speed in the car in the latter phases of the race to contend for the lead. I think the drivers who might come away from that with the most to regret would be Elio Castroneves and Simon Pagenaud. They both had misfortunes of a type. Pagenaud had an unsafe release penalty
and a misfire,
and I think would feel quite a little bit unfortunate with what happened to him. Elio Castroneves arguably looked in a little bit because he got one pit stop away just before a caution period around about lap 150, but then not long after that picked up some damage when I think it was J.R. Hildebrand was overtaking him, and that forced him to drop back.
And again, I think it's a testament actually to Rossi's achievement. He was in the thick of some ferocious dicing for 500 miles. He didn't damage the car, didn't put a scratch on the car, kept it very clean and very steady, and others like Castroneves couldn't quite do that.
I think the other thing to stress there, though, was this was his second oval race, but more importantly, this was his first race on a super speedway, and that kind of racing is very different to the short track oval racing that he did at Phoenix earlier in the year. The speeds are absolutely enormous. The level of judgment required is incredibly demanding, and it's a very, very different discipline to what you see in Formula One. So it is an extremely, I said this actually before the race began, it's a very specialised skill set, and it requires, or at least we thought it required, a lot of time to build up to, but Alexander Rossi just completely wrecked the grading curve.
Well, despite the rigours of the super speedway, it actually wasn't the crash fest that maybe we'd feared. Early on, we only really had 4 crashes of note, which was Takuma Sato, that was very minor. Then we had the coming together, Mikel Alation spinning, Conor Daly crashing in sympathy. Sergio Karam went into the wall, probably the biggest incident of the race. But we'll start with Juan Pablo Montoya, last year's champion, the first retirement, and he'd been nowhere all day until that point.
Hadn't really had a particularly good month of May, all things considered. In qualifying, he didn't make it into the Fast 9. He then had that rather silly situation on the Sunday where a garbage bag wrapped itself around his front wing and spoiled one of his qualifying efforts. Then in the race as well, at first we thought, Penske were hanging back and just not getting too deep into the thick of the fighting, biding their time for the closing stages. But for Montoya, it just never came together, and we saw him come into the pits. He put quite a bit of extra front wing angle on, presumably to help him out as he tried to get through the traffic, but the upshot of that just seemed to be that it provoked the mid-corner oversteer that he just was never ever going to catch, and you're not going to catch a spin like that at Indianapolis, and that was his race over, and that's the first time he's ever failed to finish the 500.
I don't really root for drivers as such, but there's obviously some that you want to see getting a good result, and I really wanted Sage Karam to get a good finish yesterday, because I cannot imagine how difficult it is after the incident at Pocono to have then lost the sponsorship and not to have raced an IndyCar until yesterday, and all of the pressure and stress that would have brought upon him. And he was going so well. The move he made around the outside of Townsend Bell, probably it was a symptom of being out of the car for too long, but it ended in the wall for him.
I can't add anything more to that, really. It was disappointing to see. He'd started, I think, about 23rd, and he crossed the line in 4th just before he made that attempted move around the outside of Townsend Bell. We saw all race long how difficult it was to go 2 abreast there. We did see a couple of drivers make it, but only just, and it really didn't pay off for Karam. I think, like you say, we were all really disappointed to see Karam's race end that way.
Well, for the IndyCar drivers, there is no rest whatsoever, because they're in action this weekend, Saturday and Sunday, the Detroit doubleheader on the Belle Isle Street Circuit. And if anything, I think the the Indy 500 has actually opened up the championship somewhat. We saw different cars at the front of the field, and consistently so.
Yeah, the big question now is going to be whether it just returns to being the Simon Pagenaud show when we get back onto the street courses around Detroit. And of course, it's a big venue for Penske because Roger Penske's got a lot invested in this race. That's going to be a very interesting storyline this weekend. And then, of course, you've got the simple fact that just 4 days after running in super speedway configuration, one of the fastest races in the world, they're going to be cranking on maximum downforce for the tough, tight, narrow streets of Detroit, and 2 races as well. I mean, when you've just done a 500-mile super speedway race, to go out and do 2 consecutive IndyCar races, don't underestimate the demand that places on the drivers.
Well, look forward to that this weekend. The other showpiece event of international motorsport, of course, over the weekend was the Monaco Grand Prix. The headlines are that Lewis Hamilton ended his win drought. He scored his first victory of the season, but of course, it was a lot more complicated than that.
What a feast of motor racing we had on Sunday. It's one of my favourite racing weekends of the year, to get the Indy 500 and the Monaco Grand Prix on the same race weekend, and such extremely different races as well, because you have Indy 500, which is this overdose of adrenaline and speed, and Monaco, which impresses you with its speed in a different way. I mean, obviously the speeds are much lower, but within the particular confines, it's such a special race. And if you get a good race at Monaco, it's just the icing on the cake, because it's so fabulous to see cars going around such an incredibly tight and narrow track. The race itself, in similar vein to last year, we saw the team who really should have walked to victory throw it away in the pits, and a really incredible blunder by Red Bull. And you have to say, second race in a row where Daniel Ricciardo really should have won, and but for a decision made in the Red Bull garages, that was kind of what took it away from him.
Well, the wags on the internet were suggesting within minutes of the finish that the Red Bull team was going to be fired in favour of Toro Rosso from the next race in Canada. And I think what was really interesting as well is that Daniel Ricciardo, after the race, was struggling to disguise his anger, and he's normally one of the most amiable, at least in the public presentation of the drivers, which gives an indication of just how furious he was. If you didn't see it, he came in right lap to make the change for the tyres. He arrived at the pit box. The tyres were at the local quick fit. By the time they'd sourced them, he'd lost several seconds, and the race was gone.
But there had actually arguably been a mistake earlier on by Red Bull in putting himself in a position where he was fighting with Hamilton to begin with, and this was something else that Ricciardo alluded to after the race, and it really does show how well attuned the drivers are to the strategic nuances of the race. Hamilton had got himself in a position to win because he'd not changed from wet weather tyres to intermediate tyres in this race, which started on a wet track, whereas Ricciardo had. Now, had Ricciardo stayed out, he would not necessarily have been in a situation where he could have risked losing the lead to Hamilton, because Hamilton had lost a lot of time at the beginning of the race being stuck behind Nico Rosberg. So I think it wasn't just the case for Ricciardo that he was angry at the guys for not having the tyres out there, and that was the product of some indecision in Red Bull about what type of tyres they should have. It was also a question of how, when he'd had this 10-second lead, did he end up in a fight with Hamilton in the first place?
Now, did we see a slightly different Lewis Hamilton yesterday? Because he's normally been somebody who's been quite aggressive with his tyres, but he made his wets last longer than most people, and he made the ultra super duper incredibly soft tyre last half the race.
We certainly saw a happier Lewis Hamilton on Sunday compared to the Lewis Hamilton we saw on Saturday, when he had his third power unit problem in a qualifying session for the fourth race that we've had. So yeah, he definitely cheered up a lot after that, and that was good to see. I think it's been an underestimated part of Hamilton's game how he's got on top of the nuances of this design to degrade era of tyres that we've got in Formula One. I think, early on in his Formula One career, particularly when he was partnered with Jenson Button, because Button was always so kind to his tyres, Hamilton was looked on in that way. But I think he understands now, and he really does get the tyre management game. And he has generally had a pretty good feel. I seem to remember him back at Monza when they had the wet race there in 2008, dragging a set of tyres out for quite a long time then as well, and doing pretty well with it. In a sense, this was a race that fell into Hamilton's lap, because he gained one position because a team screwed up, and he gained the other position because his teammate let him past. It's arguably surprising enough in itself, but he did, as you say, he got the job done on the tyres, and he needed to do that to be in a position to win in the first place.
And we should talk about Sergio Perez in third place.
Oh, amazing result for
Didn't
Force
see
India.
much of him on the TV, but a landmark result for the team, and when they really need it for various off-track things that we can't particularly go into. And also for Sergio Perez himself, who has been somewhat overlooked, somewhat in the shadow of Nico Hülkenberg, and actually it's Perez who's pulled out that showpiece drive.
Yeah, I felt a bit sorry for Hülkenberg in this one, because this was Hülkenberg's 100th Grand Prix start, and he's still yet to get a podium. And Perez, in his 99th start, just got his 6th. And really, Hülkenberg was the one who qualified ahead, and it was kind of the vagaries of the strategies that ended up with Perez ahead, because what we had a lot of in this race was drivers feeling like they were ready to switch from wets to intermediates or intermediates to slicks, but then getting stuck behind drivers who hadn't made those changes yet. And that was what happened to Hülkenberg. He dropped back into some traffic because he changed the tyres a little bit sooner, and Perez was a beneficiary of that. Again, taking nothing away from Perez, we say time and time again, this is just how things work out sometimes. But I think we have to also pick up on Hülkenberg's last lap pass on Nico Rosberg. Stunning piece of opportunism, and one of the very few clean on-track overtakes that we saw at Monaco.
Elsewhere, of course, for Max Verstappen, the honeymoon was shorter than that of Johnny Depp and Amber Heard's.
Yes, it was. I must admit, I'm not as au fait with the pages of the celebrity magazines as you are. But yeah, crashed in practice, crashed in qualifying, crashed in the race is what my notes read here. And let's not forget, he also crashed out of this race last year, so it's not a terrific record for Verstappen in Monaco. But keep one thing in mind, I think, when he was on track in the race, in those early phases, making his way up from the pit lane start, he, again, put on some excellent overtaking moves, was making some great progress. And I think Red Bull at this stage, and certainly we're keeping in mind how quickly Fiat was let go, are still going to be thinking it's easier to get a fast driver to stop crashing than it is to get a safe driver to go quicker.
Yeah, I agree. I think they'll let this one slide if it happens again next year. Different conversation. I think the other crash that really bothered me during the race was Jolyon Palmer, who went off very early on, and it was mainly because of the damage that Renault car sustained. You didn't see it. He seemed to lose control under acceleration on the zebra crossing. The car speared left into the barrier at quite an odd angle, because it's not the place that cars normally go off, which knocked the front section of the car loose. And then when he went further on, finished the accident at Saint-Devote, the whole front of the car was ripped away, and in a way that you don't expect to see in modern racing cars. And what it really reminded me of, that you may have seen the picture, it was a Corsi Clienti driver in the United States, Laguna Seca, in the 1990s Ferrari, who had a very slow accident, and he ripped the whole front of the car off, and it looked similar, that he just went in at the wrong angle for the carbon fibre construction.
Yeah, it was strange to see the extent of the damage to the car once it had stopped. Palmer saying, I noticed that he was still getting wheel spin in 5th gear when he was coming down the curved start-finish straight at Monaco and going over the white paint at the zebra crossings. And like you say, the car had a very big initial impact, and then as it went down the barriers and then bounced off the other barrier at Saint-Devote, a succession of smaller impacts. I think all you can say really is they're definitely going to take a close look at how that car behaved under the impact and see what lessons there are to be learned, because, as we've seen, and we're going to talk about later, some of the big crashes we've seen in other categories, it's something that they take very seriously.
So in terms of the championship there, Nico Rosberg leads Lewis Hamilton, 106 points to 82. The next race is in Canada in the second weekend of June. Two other single-seater races, or two other single-seater categories rather, in action at Monaco. GP2 Championship. And the first race was claimed by Artem Markelov, and then Nobuharu Matsushita won the sprint race. But again, in the world of GP2, nothing is straightforward, and certainly Markelov winning in slightly bizarre circumstances.
This was a very odd one, which initially had people wondering if Markelov had committed some bizarre kind of violation behind the virtual safety car. Basically, to try and cap this as quickly as possible, Norman Nato had beaten Sergei Sorokin off the line and led the race pretty comfortably. But Markelov delayed his mandatory change of tyres quite a long way. And while he was doing that, we had a succession of virtual safety car periods for various different incidents. And what happened was Markelov, through dint of these periods, was able to extend his lead over Nato, make his pit stop and come out ahead. Now, that obviously doesn't sound right, because surely if you're throwing a virtual safety car period, everyone's got to slow down and no one's going to be catching anybody. But the key thing to understand is the way the virtual safety car works in GP2 is different to how it works in Formula 1. In Formula 1, the drivers are given minimum or maximum target times that they have to hit to ensure that nobody is getting too much closer to anybody else. In GP2, they just impose a blanket speed limit, and that means if you're going through a sector that is a particularly high-speed sector at the reduced speed, you will lose more time than another driver on the same elsewhere on a part of the track that is much slower, who's sticking to the same speed limit. And it was a quirk of the timing of these virtual safety car periods that allowed Markelov to basically gain something in the order of 10 seconds over Nato, which proved to be enough for him to make the extra pit stop. I think you've got to say, it really isn't very good that the rules work in this way, that they hand a driver such a massive advantage like that. And I felt really, really sorry for Nato at the end of that race, because he could not possibly have done anything more to win it.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the Autosport picture now on the podium. It looks like sort of a pug who's been denied a treat on the podium, Norman Nato. And so in terms of the GP2 Championship then, Nato leads Markelov 49 points to 48, and the next race is another classic of the motorsport calendar, and that is the Baku round on the 18th and 19th of June. We also had the Formula Renault 2 Litre Euro Cup in Monaco. Sasha Fenestraz won the race, although the safety car, I think, was probably classified for the podium because we only had about 2.5 green flag laps. But in that time, we had a magnificent move for second place. Ferdinand Habsburg, the inside of Max Deforny. Deforny then held on to third place despite being demoted by Dorian Boccalacci on the countback. That move was scrubbed from history, so Deforny completed the podium. Sasha Fenestraz, Keith, something of a street race specialist. He's had 4 of them in his career. He's won 3.
Yeah, and this one actually only counts as half a win because they didn't hit the 75% limit, so they only awarded half points. And that was very important, of course, for Lando Norris, who'd qualified on pole position, was sent to the back of the grid because of a technical infringement, which, according to the stewards, did not result in a performance gain. But because he was down at the back and because we had so little green flag running, he wasn't able to make his way up into the points. But as half points were awarded, he still has just about kept his lead in the championship.
And half points mean that is going to be a joy to try and commentate live on the championship deciders when we try and do the maths for that. The next action is in Monza. It's a triple header on the 2nd and 3rd of July, and that will be a very different proposition, but I'm sure thoroughly entertaining racing as well. Well, let's move on to a little bit of a review of some of the news, because it has been a very long 10 days in the world of motorsport and some really quite big stories that have come out. One that broke at the start of the Monaco weekend was the lawsuit from Jules Bianchi's parents against several parties surrounding the incident in Japan that ultimately led to his death.
Yeah, the Bianchi family on Thursday notified the world that they were bringing action against the FIA Formula One group, which of course includes Formula One management, and Bianchi's former team Marussia, which has since been taken over and is now called Mana, because of that accident in the 2014 Japanese Grand Prix, and then Bianchi losing his life in July of last year. Obviously, we don't want to get into the exact specifics of talking about the case, for obvious legal reasons. I suppose all you can really say at this point is, what happened was a tragedy. The Bianchi family lost a brother and a son, and it's a terribly sad thing. This legal recourse that's open to them, if they choose to have chosen to go that way, is obviously something they feel is justified. And speaking as a parent myself, it's kind of hard to criticize or question that. If that's the way they feel they have to go, then that's for them to decide. What it means in terms of the wider motor racing world, I think, could ask some very deep questions, and it's obviously something that we're going to keep a very close eye on the developments of.
Well, it's unprecedented legal ground, but what isn't unprecedented is actually that motorsport has been incredibly good at learning from past tragedies, responding to it, and then improving safety standards. I can't think of any other sport which self-regulates so strongly, and that development really of driver safety has been amply illustrated in the European Formula 3 Championship and the British Formula 3 Championship over the past 2 weekends. So Zikong Li escaped from a monumental corkscrew incident when he collided unsighted with his teammate Ryan De Vita at the Red Bull Ring, and then Amaya Vaidyanathan at Alton Park decided the quickest route from Old Hall to Cascades was actually to do it as a cartwheel. If you've seen that latter incident, it is just incredible that he walked away with basically no injury whatsoever. The car up 20 feet in the air, tumbling through the air, and it really just shows how much safety standards have improved and how strong these modern cars are.
And also, he was a very, very lucky boy as well, because the way the car landed, obviously plays a role in that kind of thing as well. Going back to the Zikong Li crash, obviously there were 3 drivers involved in that because he went into the back of Tivita, and then Pedro Piquet was involved as well, and Tivita had light injuries, but Zikong Li has took heel fractures, which he's having to have surgery on, which is obviously not what you want to see. But when you look at the extent of the damage to the front of his Carlin Dallara chassis, really quite remarkable that he was able to survive that incident with injuries comparatively lighter than we initially feared. We were waiting quite a long time for updates on what his condition was, and we were very worried about it at the time because we didn't know what it was going to be. But thankfully, it's not as bad as we feared.
Yeah, and to an extent, these are incidents that have maybe been coming for the past couple of years. Certainly, the Zikong Li incident actually wasn't a driving standards one. Maybe Tavita could have just stopped it in the gravel rather than roll back onto the track. You could argue either way, but the closer to the competition, the accidents been escalating. This might just provide a bit of a check on driving standards.
Well, of course, Euroformula 3 last year, we had a spate of serious accidents, which we were fortunate not to have these type of injuries from. We had races abandoned, we had red flags being thrown, and we had lots and lots of questions about whether drivers were being allowed into this category at too young an age. The FIA introduced a range of different restrictions on how drivers could get into Formula 3 and how long they were allowed to spend there. And like you say, a crash like this is going to serve as a bit of a wake-up call.
So a couple of then big Formula 1 news lines. First of all, Red Bull extending the Renault engine deal through to 2018. So clearly all is love and lightness once more there.
It's an amusing thing to reflect on, given the amount of vitriol that was flying around until the very late stages of last year, and how almost begrudgingly Red Bull went back to the Renault power units. But of course, in Monaco, Red Bull had an example of the new Renault power unit for Ricciardo. Renault were running one in Magnussen's car, and it seems that they are very happy with the products of this. It was run in the Circuit de Catalunya test. All the drivers are going to have it for the Canadian Grand Prix, so they're expecting to be an awful lot more competitive, but also extending that deal through to 2018. The other dimension to keep in mind here is we now have this very complicated new set of rules about engine supply, and the FIA for the first time have taken it upon themselves to try to force engine manufacturers to supply engines to teams so that no teams end up without an engine, which was something that might have happened to Red Bull at the end of last year. This deal obviously means that Red Bull and Renault will be together for this length of time. And I think one party that might be particularly pleased to see it is Honda, because they are averse to supplying engines to another team at the moment. They're very much prioritising making their current power unit competitive. So unless we see a situation where a new team comes into Formula 1, which at this stage is unlikely to happen before 2018 anyway, Honda are in the clear as far as that concerns. So a potential political problem has potentially been averted.
Of course, any teams that do have a shortfall, they're very welcome to borrow a 2-litre Volvo with 107,000 miles on the clock, as long as they give it back to me by Monday morning. The other story then was Monza has got proposals to change its classic layout, and this is a story you broke, Keith.
It was really interesting to see this. I got a tip from a reader that this had been posted, and I've been in contact with Jarno Zafeli, who's the designer behind this. Obviously, Monza is looking at changing its layout to ensure that it can continue to host motorbike racing. But this obviously will have an impact on whether it's also able to continue hosting Formula 1, because it needs to make sure that the layout is suitable for both categories. So the proposal that they've put in place is actually getting rid of the Rettifilo chicane. Now, they've had a chicane on that part of the track since 1971 to slow the cars before they reach the Curva Grande. Now, the reason they're going to do that is because they're going to divert the cars away from the Curva Grande. Now, that's a controversial point that some people aren't so keen on. I have to say, having had a bit of a close look at the diagrams and with some of the stuff that's been sent through to me, I think it looks really like quite an elegant solution. The Rettifilo chicane that they've had down there since 2000 is very, very slow, and frankly, I think it probably causes as many problems as it solves.
Yeah, I'm in two minds about this, because my worry is it's going to actually ruin the racing at Monza, because into the Rettifilo, great overtaking opportunity, but more importantly, out of the Rettifilo through the Curva Grande to the second chicane is where you see so much overtaking and some really great racing, and I'm worried we're going to lose that. Yeah,
you do, but you also see, I think, the potential for some nasty crashes down at the Rettifilo just because they're bringing the cars down from such a high speed to such a low speed.
Well, it's not the first time Monza has considered things. Whether or not they go through with it will remain to be seen, because when I was there last year, I picked up in the bookshop a document called Monza 2, which was the planning permission proposal for an extension to the Monza circuit in the mid-1970s, basically by adding a flat high-speed oval to the lap to double its lap length to make sure it kept Formula 1 then.
And hadn't they already done that once before by building the original oval?
Exactly, and that went nowhere. So we'll see what happens. The final piece of news this week is we had a provisional calendar for the FIA Formula E Championship for Season 3. And the big omission was no London round. And almost concurrent to that calendar coming out was then a statement from lawyers which confirmed that agreement had been reached between local residents, Wandsworth Council and Formula E to go ahead with the Battersea Park rounds on the 2nd and 3rd of July this year. Very vague statement. Reading between the lines, it's quite easy to see that probably A has led to B.
Yeah, I don't think that's too cynical a conclusion to draw. But that was a deal that absolutely had to happen, because without it, the second season of Formula E had finished. As it is, we will now go on. We'll have these 2 races in Battersea Park, and we'll decide who the champion's going to be, and that's going to be very exciting to see. More about the proposals for the Season 3 calendar. It really does seem to involve an awfully high degree of turnover. I mean, the Beijing season opener has gone. Various new rounds have been proposed, but these are all to be announced, to be confirmed. We don't know what the layouts are going to be. We've had a lot of flux in the calendar in Formula E this year. It would be a great shame if we were going to next year and have yet more, possibly even more, of that happening again.
I mean, my reflections are, firstly, there's a lot to be read in to the fact that cities that have hosted races are dropping away from it. I think, secondly, it's not so much a calendar as at times a list of cities where Formula E would like to race. And it's part of me that wonders if I bumped into Alejandro Agag at Watford Gap Services and said, do you want to race here? It would appear on the next iteration of the calendar.
So you're suggesting they should have a race around Watford Gap Services?
Absolutely. So that is it for the news for this week. Let's have a little look ahead to next weekend. Slightly quieter weekend of action. But of course, Keith, you're going to be on duty at least some of the time for the IndyCar Duel in Detroit.
I am going to be doing the fill-in commentary for the second of the 2 Duel in Detroit races on Sunday evening. So I'm looking forward to seeing how many of the chassis survive unscathed from the first race and make it back for another punishing round around Detroit.
Meanwhile, I'm off to Paul Ricard for the Euroformula Open and International GT Open, and I think it's been really interesting start to both seasons for those categories. In the Euroformula Open, we've seen the wins split between Jack Aitken and Leonardo Pulcini.
And some terrific racing between the pair of them at Spa a couple of weeks ago.
Absolutely, and they've been the class of the field. Jack Aitken said in Estoril, this is absolutely a one-off. Then he turned up in Spa. I would be astonished if he's not on the entry list for Paul Ricard, because he senses a chance of getting the title. In the International GT Open, we've had a really, really open start to the season. Sean Balfe and Phil Keane are leading the championship, but they've got essentially works or semi-works McLarens, semi-works BMW snapping their heels. And in Paul Ricard, and this is a reason to watch alone, we've got a special Lamborghini entry, Andrea Caldarelli and Vitantonio Liuzzi.
Oh, the Liuzzi's racing. Excellent.
So that is going to be awesome. Should say now, as an advance warning, if I get distracted during commentary, at Paul Ricard, the commentary boxes are above the pit garages and they look out onto the private airstrip, which has been built at Paul Ricard, which is why it's such a popular testing venue. There is a gentleman there who has a toy MiG, the Russian fighter, and he generally takes that for a play or two during the course of the weekend. Where Keith and I won't be this weekend is at the Lausitzring, and the DTM returns there. And we've also got the British Touring Car Championship in action at Alton Park, which very full grid in the BTCC this year, but actually the Alton Park round sometimes comes in for criticism for not enough overtaking.
Well, I think when they tried the experiment with running the longer classic layout of the Alton Park circuit recently, it didn't work so well. And of course, it is one of the narrower tracks as well. But you will never, ever in a month of Sundays get me saying a negative word about it, because it's my home track from back when I lived up in Cheshire. And I absolutely love it to bits.
You're a very proud West Yorkshireman, and we salute you for that. Well,
speechless with rage, then.
Well, we'd love once more to get your feedback on Motorsport Extra, what you'd like to hear, maybe what you'd not like to hear so much of. So please do get in touch with Keith and I on Twitter, @BenCommentator, @Keith Collantine is the way to do so. And also, when we record again in a couple of weeks' time, we'd love to have some of your questions. So do tweet us with questions that you'd like to pick up in the podcast, because we want you to be part of this show as well. So anything you'd like to hear us discuss, then do get in touch. We'll make sure we include it next time around. So thanks very much for joining us for Motorsport Extra. It's been a momentous weekend of motor racing. It's been a fantastic start to the season, and we got a busy weekend ahead of us, and we'll be talking to you again very, very soon.